Today we have with us a legal expert who's going to talk about informality in livelihood. Hello, everyone. Today we have with us Prashant Narang. He is a lawyer who has done many things. He's now leading the research team at a policy think tank in Delhi. Over to you, Prashant, please. Let's talk to us.
Thank you so much, Subodh. Hi, everyone. This is Prashant Narang. I am trained as a lawyer. But, in New Delhi, once I also before doing law, actually, I did hospitality management, dreaming of grand hotels and luxury banquets. But it seemed destiny had other plans. And I had once attended a residential seminar on public policy, and I thought it was just another event. But, I discovered that I was quite interested in social sciences, and law became my new compass. I joined faculty of law, Delhi University, became a law student. While most students were doing legal internships, I actually decided to organize as a student youth group. And we were activists. We produced a documentary on auto rickshaws. And back then, around this was 2007-8, there were a lot of op-eds about how dishonest auto rickshaw drivers were because they were always overcharged in New Delhi. So my question was that why do these drivers charge so much? And we found out that it was not because of some cultural norms, but it was economics of licensing. The license cost more than the vehicle itself, and it was all thanks to the Supreme Court orders that capped the number of licenses in New Delhi. Of course, the auto rickshaw drivers couldn't get any formal credit from banks, so they had to turn to informal financiers, many lenders. They charged quite high interest rates. And because they had to pay back at very high interest rates, they could not go by the government decided meter fares. And so they had to overcharge. But the story didn't end there. By the time I completed my LLB, and I joined a lawyer for a couple of months before joining my master's, I assisted that lawyer on cases involving cycle rickshaw pullers in New Delhi. So, Delhi had, the Municipal Corporation of Delhi had issued 99,000 licenses, but the number of cycle rickshaw pullers far exceeded the number of licenses, which meant that many of the cycle rickshaw pullers were illegal because they were without licenses. And the traffic police would confiscate those illegal cycle rickshaws, would send them to junkyard, cut them into pieces, and they were sold off. And then an NGO had challenged, some of the restrictions. And I found out that there were some restrictions such as the owner must be the puller, which means that nobody could own more than one cycle rickshaw. And they could own only one cycle rickshaw, which meant that they could not give it on hiring. Nobody else could hire the cycle rickshaw, and they could give it on rent. So the idea was to achieve equality. It was inspired from socialist ideals. But the problem was that a lot of cycle rickshaw pullers were probably, let's say, migrant labor who would come to cities like Delhi or maybe Amritsar or other cities during season when there is no agriculture work back home. And they may not be interested in buying a cycle rickshaw, and their purpose was to rent a cycle rickshaw. And this restriction made it very difficult for them to rent a cycle rickshaw. So actually, a restriction which was meant to help the migrant labor was meant to help the labor, made their lives very difficult. And I also found out that this restriction was challenged before the Supreme Court 4 times in the decade of 80s. And but in 2010, finally, the Delhi High Court decided that this restriction was unconstitutional. And the reasoning was that, there was no such restriction on any other profession in any other sector. So there was no restriction that said that you have to be limited to one shop or one office or one industry or one factory. Then why should you be limited to only one cycle rickshaw? And plus, why to make hiring and renting illegal? There is no such restriction in any other sector. That was one thing. And then second thing, the court said that, what is your magic formula? They asked the MCD, how did you decide the number of 99,000?
Yeah.
The NGO argued that the number of actual cycle rickshaw pullers was around 600,000.
Yeah.
Which meant that more than 500,000 cycle rickshaw pullers were illegal. And so the court asked, there is no formula for deciding the number of, let's say, panwalas or number of offices or number of schools or number of barbers in the city. So how do you decide the number of cycle rickshaw in the city?
Yeah.
And the court also held that this limit of 99,000 is also illegal. Third thing is they also found out that there was nowhere in the law, there was no provision in the law that allowed the municipal corporation to confiscate cycle rickshaws and send them to junkyard. So, for example, as a car owner, if I violate a traffic norm, the authorities can issue a ticket, can penalize me, maybe 100 rupees, 500 rupees, right? But they can't confiscate my car and send it to a junkyard and sell it off. It was not just there in the law. So they were doing completely illegal things. And the court also held that this confiscation is in violation of the law. And they ordered that MCD cannot do that. So this was, also sort of a eureka moment for me. And also I could compare the similarity between the cycle rickshaw pullers and the life of auto rickshaw drivers. Only thing is that while the MCD was involved in restricting the livelihood of auto rickshaw and cycle rickshaw pullers, the situation in the auto rickshaw sector was created by the orders of the Supreme Court. So there was an environment activist who had filed a PIL before the Supreme Court in late 90s, and the Supreme Court, while hearing the public interest litigation, decided that there should be a cap on the number of auto rickshaws, and all auto rickshaws should mandatorily switch from petrol and diesel to CNGs. The court was making policy. And mind you, this order was not passed for private cars. It was only passed for auto rickshaws. And so while people may perceive the Indian judiciary to be pro-poor, the Supreme Court was actually quite harsh on the poor auto rickshaw drivers. So they created unreasonable restrictions by virtue of passing those orders, and they were kind of legislating. The problem is, of course, there is no court over and above the Supreme Court. Right. The Supreme Court is, supreme, although we say not infallible, but they had no recourse. And so in 1998, the number of auto rickshaws was around 85,000 in Delhi, because they put a cap that no new licenses could be issued, and they had to mandatorily switch to CNG. Not all auto rickshaws could afford the CNG kit. And so the number over a period of years came down from 85,000 to 45,000. The city was growing. People needed more auto rickshaws, but it created an artificial scarcity of auto rickshaws. And the result was disastrous for the environment. Why? Because the number of private cars went up from 25 lakhs to over 60 lakhs. So 60 lakh would be 6 million. Yeah. So
Yes.
from 2.5 million to 6 million. And Delhi had more number of private cars than the combined number of 3 other largest metros in India.
Yeah.
And all thanks to the Supreme Court for creating this disaster in Delhi. So after doing my master's, actually during my master's, then I picked up the topic of restrictions in the legal profession. And I found out that lawyers in India cannot advertise. They cannot, at that time, they could not even form limited liability partnerships with chartered accountants or with company secretaries. So there were no multidisciplinary partnerships allowed. The number of partners was limited back then. They could not do any kind of moonlighting, which means if they're lawyers, they cannot take up any other profession. They have to only practice, regardless of how good their practice works, but that's not allowed. So there were many, many restrictions. So of course, lawyers can't structure themselves as companies, even now. Companies are not allowed in India. A legal company is not allowed. So most law firms are structured maybe as partnerships or LLPs, but not as companies. Even the law firms, law firms that do only transaction lawyering and not litigation, they are also not allowed to be structured as companies. So there were many restrictions. And the result is that, you had mostly families dominating the legal profession. It was very difficult for first generation graduates to enter and make a mark in the legal profession. And therefore, you see a lot of nepotism in the legal profession. The other thing interesting in the legal profession, I found out that the regulator in India regulating the legal profession is elected by its regulators that it's supposed to govern. So it creates perverse incentives. So if the lawyers whom you're supposed to regulate have to vote for you, why would you regulate them honestly? Why would you be strict with them? Why would you take any disciplinary action against any errant lawyers? So later, after doing my master's, I was assisting a lawyer, and he had a matter involving a case against an errant lawyer before the Bar Council of India. And he sent me to represent the client. And I was quite happy, because I wouldn't get a chance to argue before the court in the High Court or in the Supreme Court. And this time, without asking me, he just sent me to go to the Bar Council and argue this matter. And when I reached the Bar Council, the office of the Bar Council was locked. So forget, often we come across instances in the courts where the judge may be on leave or, the other party is asking for adjournments. That was not the case. Here, the office was locked. And of course, recently Law Commission, I think a couple of years ago, they have done a study of the Advocates Act, and they also found very, very interesting anecdotes from across India about strikes and, many other such instances from various states, and why Bar Council is so ineffective. So, and a lot of people have written many things about it, but nobody actually touches upon the core issue. And that core issue also makes it very, very difficult to initiate any kind of legal reforms, because the lawyer lobby is very, very strong. And there's a lot of politicization of legal profession because of the elections involved, in the Bar Council, which is a statutory body, but it's an elected body and not a body of nominated members. And also the Bar Association, which are informal associations of lawyers are also elected at the local level, and that also politicizes. And many aspiring lawyers actually, not aspiring lawyers, but many lawyers who are aspiring politicians are actively involved in these kind of politics. Okay, after this, at some point, I actually litigated for a year and a half in the Supreme Court, assisted senior advocate. And then I joined Center for Civil Society, the think tank where I work presently. Initially, my job was mainly about legal research. And I initially looked at Right to Education Act from the perspective of private school owners. And it was very similar situation because the law made it very difficult for the private school owners to start a school, to run a school, and even to shut down a school. And in India, especially in New Delhi, where there's a scarcity of schools, it's very difficult to get your kid admitted at the entry level, especially in a school of choice. And I found it very surprising, that there is so huge demand for schools and people could pay, whatever the fees the school asked for, many people could pay, yet there was scarcity of school. Why is that? And the answer, we found out that you're not allowed to run a school for profit. The school has to be registered as an NGO, which means that either you register it as a trust or a society. So how would a trust or society have access to that kind of capital? So, NGOs may of course raise money, but, to open a school, you need land. And in Delhi, land is so expensive. I mean, you would need something like 50 crores or 100 crore of rupees. And if you don't allow schools to earn profit, who would invest that kind of capital for opening a school? And it made school opening very, very difficult. So of course, there were some schools earlier, and maybe some decades earlier, the Delhi Development Authority had a policy to give free land to schools. But even then, the building and the infrastructure cost quite a lot. To add to that, the Central Board of Secondary Education also had stringent norms, and those were mainly infrastructure-related norms as to how many rooms you should have, what should be the size of the playground, how many science laboratories you should have in order to get the board affiliation. And so the board has affiliation, and you need to have that kind of affiliation if you want your students to sit for those exams. And the Directorate of Education, which is under the state government, also had norms if you want recognition. So you need board affiliation for your students to be able to sit for the exams. And you also need recognition from the government so that you can be called as a recognized school. So it's dual licensing. And most of the conditions are related to infrastructure and inputs. So, the size of the land plot, the number of rooms, buildings. In some states, they actually also decide the size of the staircase and the size of the window and the door. And the teacher qualifications, the teacher must have minimum this degree and should have passed one exam set by the government. And, I may be, let's say, master's in law, but I can't teach in a school. You may be a PhD, but you can't teach in a school. You have to have a bachelor in education, and you should have passed the exam. So, all sort of those kind of restrictions, and how much salary you pay to the teacher, that's fixed. It has to be at par with the public schools, meaning the government schools. Then how much fee can a private school charge? So there are caps on the fee that the school can charge. So it was then, once you find all these things, then it's no longer surprising as to how difficult it is to run a school. and just so many restrictions in the education sector. While we need just so many schools, because of course the state capacity is limited. State doesn't have, government doesn't have enough funds to be able to open um, uh, high class schools for all kids in Delhi. Actually, government schools were themselves in very poor shape in 2007, 2010. Most of the school buildings were in dilapidated condition. Some of the schools were being run in tents or quota cabins. And teacher vacancy was very high. Government schools themselves did not have enough teachers. And in 2010, India enforced a new law called Right to Education Act, which was actually Right to Schooling Act. It called itself education, but it focused on schooling, four walls and a roof.
Yeah.
Called a school, but not on the quality of education. And the result of this act was actually closing down of many private schools because they would not get, they would not be able to get recognition, or basically what it meant was licensing. So again, unintended consequences of trying to enhance the quality of the schooling, and what it led to was actually school closure. So, okay, so this was another sector where and because of the licensure, it perpetuated informality in the education sector also, because then so many schools that did not have recognition became unrecognized. And like people say, child in conflict with law, I would call it entrepreneur in conflict with the law, because the law wants to burden you with so many conditions that you are unable to fulfill, but nevertheless you are fulfilling a need in the market, but you are not able to fulfill the legal requirements. And the next sector which I got to explore at Center for Civil Society was street vending. So when I joined Center for Civil Society in 2013, right next year in 2014, Parliament passed a law which was called the Street Vendor Act. It was intended to protect street vendors from harassment. And this is very interesting, harassment from whom? I mean, who harasses street vendors? Is there a mafia? Are there hooligans? Are there goons in the street who are harassing street vendors?
No.
Turns out that the state, meaning either the municipal corporation officials or the police officials, are harassing the street vendors. And then who would protect them from the police? So it's funny. But back then in 2014, we were celebrating in Center for Civil Society. Wow, we have a new law and this will protect the street vendors. And actually, Center for Civil Society, was involved in the advocacy of a street vendor law for many years. When I joined, the law was passed, they were celebrating it. But in 2015 in Jan, we were getting complaints from the city of Jaipur. We got calls from street vendors that, their harassment still continues. So we decided to visit the city of Jaipur. And the day we reached there, we met some street vendors. And again, they got calls that the street vendors in the market were being harassed. So we went there and we saw huge deployment of police and public officials removing street vendors. And they were frantically, some of them were, the women street vendors were crying. And, there were bulldozers, because in Jaipur, they have this concrete platforms where they sit. Those were being demolished. There was quite a scene there. And we tried speaking to police. They won't listen to us. After this was over, we visited a police station. We met the police officials and we said, what you did was violation of the law. And they said, which law are you talking about? And I said, street vendor law is passed by Parliament in 2014. I said, we don't know such a law. I said, that's very strange. I mean, are you not part of the Union of India? You are in this country. Rajasthan is in this country. how is this possible that the law doesn't apply to you? And then we filed a public interest litigation in the Rajasthan High Court. And guess what? After a year, the court passed a judgment saying that the law is not applicable to state of Rajasthan.
Wow.
And, I was just shocked. I could understand that the municipal corporation could violate the law. The police was unaware of the law. But the High Court of a state saying that the law passed by the parliament, which was notified, duly notified by the union government and made it applicable to all states, the state government saying this doesn't apply to us. It was unbelievable. It was totally unbelievable. We met a member of the parliament in the upper house of the parliament who represented, Rajasthan in the upper house of the parliament. We went to that MP and we asked him, we requested him to raise this question in the parliament, whether this law is applicable to Rajasthan or not. We had the notification. There was no confusion. We were, of course, 101% sure that the law is indeed applicable. But, just imagine the rule of law, that something which is just so obvious that a first-year law student could have decided that case right in the first hearing. It's a question of fact, and you have the notification widely available online. Everybody had, access to it, and yet the court is saying, well, this law is not applicable because there is no special notification passed for Rajasthan. But you don't need that. The law is notified for whole of India. So the MP raised that question in the parliament, and of course the minister, honorable minister, answered saying that yes, the law is applicable, and we got that answer on record. So we took that and filed an appeal in the Supreme Court of India. Well, the Supreme Court took 1 year to decide that matter. And they passed a very weak order just saying, and this was passed after the summer. I don't know if you know, Indian Supreme Court has summer vacations.
Yeah.
The British system of summer vacations still continues.
Yeah.
So for 6 weeks, they don't sit. So during the summer vacations, the state of Rajasthan actually, came up with draft rules and draft scheme under the law, meaning that they took some initiative, they took some action and showed that, yeah, we are implementing the law. So right after summer vacation, when the bench heard the matter, they said, oh, this matter is infructuous because, of course, the state has indeed taken some steps to implement the law. The matter is infructuous, so we don't need to decide this. They passed a very weak order that because the matter is infructuous, we dispose of this matter.
Yeah.
They never said that the High Court was wrong, and then the act was indeed applicable. So much of reluctance to strengthen the law and to call a wrong as wrong, because they don't want to kind of strengthen the cause of street vending. And I wondered, if it took us 2 years to get the law implemented in one state, and India has 30 states. So it means that you need 60 years to get the law implemented in whole of country. And this was probably not the most effective way to get the law implemented. And so what I thought was, let's create an index, a comparative index, which would measure and compare the status of implementation, across states. So I, along with an economist friend, his name is Yugang Goyal, is now teaching at Plain University. We created an index, an implementation index, and we came out with this first edition in 2017, and we, sent it across to all stakeholders. The union government, actually, the Ministry of Urban Affairs and Housing, liked the index very much, and they invited us and they said, we'll share the data with you, why don't you bring out the next edition? So we revised it, they gave us the data, and we brought out 2 more editions of the index, one in 2020 and one in 2021. So we had 3 editions of the index, And the index actually led to most states coming out with their draft rules and draft schemes under the Act. The Act is not fully implemented, but at least the draft rules and draft schemes, the school rules and the schemes were drafted and notified. So that was the success of the index. So, I could see the pattern from auto rickshaws to cycle rickshaws to schools to legal profession, and then also in street vending. And the latest that we undertook at CCS was agriculture. And agriculture happens to be one of the most restricted sectors in India. So 1991 reforms that India witnessed, you will see many rag to riches stories in India. People became entrepreneurs, they found good jobs in many sectors, but farmers remain poor. And the reason for their poverty is, they just can't buy more land because there is a cap on how much land they can own. They can't sell their land because there is restriction on who they can sell their land to. They can't sell their land to non-farmers. There are restrictions in parts of the country, what they can sow, what they can sell, what they can buy, what seeds, what technology they can buy, and what they can use. For example, they can't use genetically modified seeds that American farmers can use, or even Bangladeshi farmers can use. Right? BT brinjal is allowed in Bangladesh, but not in India. And farmers sometimes have to smuggle that illegally to be able to sow, and often they are cheated by selling spurious seeds. They believe them to be high quality HTBT GM seeds, but they turn out to be spurious seeds because of those seeds are illegal in the country. So they don't have access to technology. They don't have access to capital. They can't lease their land, and so on and so forth. So it's just countless restrictions in agriculture. So the threat across all these sectors is the restriction on entrepreneurship, and the informality it perpetuates. I sometimes question, the law, street vending law, as I asked you, and I asked myself that who does it protect the street vendors from the police, and then who would protect the vendors from the police itself. So and then the idea of regulation, it's also regulating the street vendors, but do we regulate pedestrians? We don't regulate pedestrians, right? In India, do we regulate wedding processions?
No.
We don't regulate wedding procession. There is no licensing required for wedding processions, right? There are just so many private uses of public spaces that may not be regulated. I understand that stationary vendors who sit at a spot need to be regulated, but I find it difficult to think of any reason as to why mobile vendors need to be regulated. So, or for that matter, schools need to be licensed, especially when we have scarcity of schools. And similarly, comparing, if we don't regulate the number of private cars in a city, if we don't compel private cars to switch to CNG, why did we do that to auto rickshaws?
Yeah. Well, I think you have an economist understands easily what you are saying. Okay, maybe others don't, but especially, it's very clear that when you have an over-regulated sector, you are going to get either shortage of supply, or you are going to get unexpected results, because every regulation, every policy has benefits that you cannot, or impact that you cannot anticipate. And if you have so many regulations, then the combination of those together is surely going to get you results that you didn't understand. And what you are saying is that I mean, on one side, what you're saying is that overregulation actually creates, and it's well known, the overregulation creates scarcity and high prices. It's well known. I mean, the examples are there of the medallion taxi cabs in New York City. And the medallions at one point, medallion means license, was selling for $600,000. $6 lakh was the price of a taxi cab medallion, because there was a limit on the number of taxi cabs. And of course, when Uber and Lyft came, but they were not under the Taxi Act, so the price of the medallion fell. So when you have these kinds of regulations, especially when you have regulations that are meant to support the poor, you really don't know what the poor want, and you have got a paternal attitude, patriarchal attitude to saying, look, I want to support them. What you don't support them in is earning money. Okay, you're thinking I must give them some dignity and I must give them this, but really what they want is just a bloody chance to make some money. And if they have to work hard, they're willing to work hard to do it. But you set up a system in which it is very difficult to make good money by just working hard. Okay, so same thing for auto rickshaws. You are trying to protect the consumers, the middle class, and you're going to give them regulated fares, but which is fine. You can have regulated fares, but then if you don't think back as to the costs of the providers, okay, and you don't take account of those costs. I worked for regulatory agency in the US, and you have to take account of the costs of the regulator before you set the regulated fare. And it's not indexed to inflation, right? You just set the fare and you don't regulate it. You don't have an index for inflation, and the costs are subject to inflation, right? So you don't index the fare to regulation. So, I mean, in the US, in the energy sector, we have, for many years now, there is an indexation. Okay. So that, certain costs are called pass-through. Okay. And even the Supreme Court allowed this pass-through costs in the Mundra case in India, which is the Tata power plant in Gujarat, that if they were to buy Indonesian coal rather than Indian coal, then they could pass on that cost through into the tariff. So it's regulatory pass-through, automatic pass-through. You don't have to litigate it, automatic pass-through. So that if there is a rise in the petrol prices, then the fare goes up automatically. Okay, doesn't have to be mandated, doesn't have to be litigated. But that whole notion that you have to give a reasonable rate of return to the auto rickshaw fellow. I mean, those people think they are overcharging, but are they rich? No, they are not rich. They're still driving that bloody rotten auto rickshaw for 12, 13 hours a day and breathing the fumes because they don't have the windows, so they are getting their lungs exposed. So this, I think, is understood by economists very well. I think it would be helpful to you to make it into a law in economics, because that's where you are headed, kind of a business or an analysis. And as you already worked with an economist, I think you have these licensing requirements in the US that to be a barber, you need to be licensed. And I say, what? In the pandemic, my wife is cutting my hair. So I'm not going to the barber. So what the heck is this barber license for? To prevent them from chopping off my ear or something? But I think it will be helpful to work with an economist who can really understand with you not just the law. Of course, the economists don't know the law that well, but some do. I think I've pretty, because of all the work that I've done, I understand the law, and I'm now working in the econ legal field in the US. But it's really, I'm glad that you are doing this, and it's really very helpful to know that you are looking out for the income of the people rather than anything else. This really the key, the income, right, of the poor people who are trying to make money in the informal sector or even the formal sector. Auto rickshaw is pretty formal now, but they are to make money. And if you don't take account of their costs in setting the fare, and you don't have a system of indexing for inflation in setting the fares, it doesn't
I
work.
see your point, Subodh. I think so. Income is one thing, but I said, the whole idea of this entrepreneurship in conflict with law, what does this conflict do is it takes away the dignity of the people. So
Yeah,
one may be able to earn income by, through means which may not strictly be in accordance with the law, but then what it does is it breeds immorality and takes away the dignity.
I agree with you. What you are doing with many of the laws is not just reducing the income, but you're freezing the structure. You're
Yeah.
freezing the structure. And freezing the structure is not really workable. There has to be flexibility. There has to be understanding of entrepreneurship, as you rightly pointed out. Anyway, this is not a place for me to discuss my opinions. It's a place
No,
for
no, but
you
it's helpful.
to,
It's so helpful to also listen because you are an economist and to get your opinion and
yeah, we
sort
can
of
do that
reflection.
offline. Okay, we can continue our dialogue offline, and I
Sure.
can certainly be helpful to you if I can be. But I think here I would rather not be the pontificator. The all speaking should be done by the speaker. That's my rule here. So of course I'm very interested in the subject, and I think uh, most people don't realize how powerful and important the law is, and that writing the laws very clearly, and then the notifications and the draft rules and all, that is really where it makes a difference. Not just the law passed by parliament. It takes time to actually trickle down to the people, and that you have to be involved in that part, which is the practical implementation and interpretation of the law. Because the police guy is not going to read the Parliament Act. Police guy is going to get talking points or action points from. I think that has to, the people interested should actually be writing those laws instead of saying the state is doing it. I think it should be something that a think tank like yours should take a law and say, okay, this is the law, this is the structure of the draft, or you can give them a draft of the what do you call them, the action points or the interpretation in practice of those, that this is how this law will actually be implemented. I think it would be very, very useful to produce those, a law that you like and you support, but then they take 2 or 3 years, right? But why don't you produce those points in a draft format? And if you are got the resources, you can even tailor it at request to each state. Okay. So you want me to give you the generic talking points for Madhya Pradesh, that Madhya Pradesh says, okay, this is the law, how do we implement this right to education, which is right to schooling, that's so that it works, and you say, okay, here it is. But you want me to further look at Madhya Pradesh, then I'll do it. Now, of course, you have to have money and resources for this. It's not for free. But that's, I think, if you are interested in these things, and you obviously are, I think that is where the action is, not just in the, of course, you need the High Court support and the Supreme Court support, and you know that better than me. But where I would like to see is the action points where the actual implementers are going to, and also to produce in the local language in very simple things to understand. Maybe just a WhatsApp message now. Nobody produces cards that under the law, these are your rights. Right? Okay. It's written in the local language that the new law has been passed. Under the law, we will have this, and these are the do's and don'ts. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. This is what the police can do. Police can't do, in very simple language of today it would be a WhatsApp message that would go out.
Mhm.
And everybody these days is on WhatsApp, the vendors and all, they all have it. So it's not a matter of excluding anybody, everybody has it. I think that would be great. That would be
Yeah.
you-
What we did was we analyzed the rules and the schemes of each state. But you're right, I mean, to produce it in forms which would be easily comprehensible and digestible for masses. So maybe do that in Hindi and do that in bite sizes. That makes more sense.
I mean, look, I'm not involved in these things, but this is pretty much, I would say, I'm often involved or have been involved, not in legal projects, but in economic projects. And then we need to convey to the ultimate beneficiaries, whom we want to be the ultimate beneficiaries, that this is what the scheme means to you in very simple language. Under the scheme, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. Like when we were introducing solar power in rural Indonesia, we would have a campaign to tell the households that this cannot run more than a TV and lights, okay? Don't expect it to do this solar system you will get. It can do only this, it cannot do more. So if somebody comes and tells you that the solar system I'm selling you will allow you to run an electric iron, say, right? It won't be able to do that. So you need to give the consumer the explanation of what the new scheme or the new law means to them. So we would always say, okay, this is the program, this is the scheme. It's not a law, it's a program, it's a scheme. And this is what it can do for you. And this is what it cannot do for you. And don't be fooled by somebody who comes and says, listen, this is a great new thing now endorsed by the World Bank and the government, and it will do all these things for you, because there's this. So I'm just saying that this has been sort of my thinking, and I think perhaps it could be something that you could do.
No, makes sense. Yeah. Could do that.
Okay, we are sort of running out of time now. So
Yeah.
I just ask you to, if you have some final thoughts to share with us. Yes.
Yeah, I think, I have a kid who is in 4th grade. And often I think that what is it that he's not learning at the school and he should be learning. And I think of critical thinking skills and teaching him logical fallacies at some point. Maybe I'm not sure if this is the right age, but maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the line. I think one thing that all of us should study is critical thinking and basically inculcate a habit of questioning. So that what the court legislates, what the court orders, and it's not a slip of tongue when I said court legislates. Indian
Well,
court do legislate.
yeah, I mean, that's a whole separate topic which I won't open up here. But
Yeah. So we need to question. We need to question the state, be it the courts or be it the police or be it the government, in form of whatever laws they pass, whatever judgments they give. And you don't need to be a lawyer or an economist to be able to do that.
no.
An Aam Aadmi, a common citizen, should be able to question those things. And that's where I think we need to work hard to be able to make people aware as to so that they can just ask questions. I think that's important.
Yeah,
very, very important.
I agree with you on that. That is certainly missing in our system. We don't inculcate it at all. So if the school won't do it, only the family environment can do it. The schools can't even imagine except some very elite schools,
Yeah.
and then you also don't want to end up sending your kids to very elite schools because there's a negative to that they don't know the real world also. So
Yeah.
they may learn how to think, but they may not know the reality of life. Anyway, thank you so much, Prashant. It was fascinating to listen to you, and we can keep in touch offline, but we are running. I mean, normally we don't run this long, but it's been fascinating what you're saying. So thank you, and I will send you the link today or tomorrow, okay, on YouTube.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you for inviting me and having me.
Okay, all right. Bye-bye to everybody. We'll have another young person or an expert soon. Till then, I say bye.